Lila and Marcus never expected a weekend getaway to turn into a nightmare. When they inherited the old beach house on the cliffs, they thought it was just a quiet retreat. But from the moment they stepped inside, something was watching, something ancient, and something that didn't want them to leave. The first time I saw the beach house, it looked both magnificent and menacing. Perched on the edge of the cliffs, its wooden frame weathered by decades of wind and salt, it seemed like it had been waiting for me for years. The sun hit the peeling paint just right, and the shadows it cast made the house appear alive, almost breathing. I had inherited it from an uncle I barely remembered, someone whose name I'd only heard in passing, and yet something about the house pulled me in. As I walked up the uneven stone path, the sand crunching beneath my shoes, I felt a strange mixture of excitement and unease, like stepping into a place that should not exist. The front door groaned in protest as I pushed it open, releasing a rush of stale, salty air that carried the scent of old wood and dampness. Dust hung in the air, coating the furniture and floor in a fine layer, sparkling faintly in the slivers of sunlight that sneaked through the broken blinds. Every step I took made the floorboards creak and groan, like the house was complaining at my intrusion. The walls, cracked and faded, seemed to lean inward slightly, enclosing me, watching me. I ran my fingers along the peeling paint and felt a strange vibration, almost like the heartbeat of the house itself. I began exploring room by room. The living room was vast but empty, with only the skeletal remains of furniture covered in yellowed sheets. The fireplace was blackened with age, the hearth coated in dust, yet faint scorch marks suggested it had burned recently, though I had seen no evidence of firewood or ash. The kitchen smelled faintly of rot, a mixture of salt and old fish. Rusted utensils lay scattered across the counters, some bent as though they had been dropped violently. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end, and yet I couldn't stop myself from looking closer, inspecting every corner, every shadow. Upstairs, the bedrooms were eerily pristine, though the air was heavy and stale. Each bed was neatly made, the sheets smooth and untouched, the pillows perfectly fluffed as if someone had expected me to arrive and left them ready. The closets were empty, save for a few moth-eaten coats hanging like ghosts. I felt a growing pressure in my chest, an unshakable sense that I was not alone. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced that shadows shifted when I wasn't looking. Each time I did, I saw nothing but the feeling remained, crawling over my skin like ice. By late afternoon, the house had grown darker, even with sunlight streaming through the windows. The wind began to pick up outside, rattling the shutters and whistling through the cracks in the walls. I was drawn to the deck at the back of the house, where the cliffs dropped sharply to the ocean below. The waves crashed against the rocks in a furious rhythm, each one echoing like the heartbeat of the world itself. That's when I first noticed a shadow at the edge of the deck. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, a tree branch swaying in the wind. But then it shifted, too deliberate to be random, and I felt my stomach clench in cold terror. I blinked, and the figure vanished, leaving behind only a single dark footprint on the weathered wooden planks. It was too large to be mine, wet and heavy, pressed into the wood like an imprint of someone or something who had been watching me. I stepped back slowly, every instinct screaming at me to leave, yet my feet remained rooted to the spot. The air felt colder, heavier, as though the house itself was aware of my fear and feeding on it. That night, I tried to sleep in the living room, the ocean's roar growing louder, more menacing. The shadows cast by the moonlight danced across the floor in unnatural ways, forming jagged, twisting shapes. Then came the whisper, soft, almost imperceptible at first, echoing through the floorboards and walls. I told myself it was the wind, or perhaps the sound of the waves, but the words, or what sounded like words, were unmistakable. I could feel them surrounding me, circling me, pressing against my skull. When I dared to open my eyes, I caught my reflection in the large, cracked mirror in the hallway. For a brief moment, it did not match me. The reflection smiled, a slow, deliberate curl of lips that my own face did not make. My heart slammed in my chest as I stumbled backward, the whispers growing louder, more urgent. Something was in the house with me, something that had been waiting patiently for my arrival, and it had been watching all along. As I finally drifted into a restless sleep, the wind outside screamed against the cliffs, and the ocean below churned with a violent energy. I could have sworn I felt hands brush my shoulder in the dark, though the room was empty. I woke with a taste of salt in my mouth, the floor beneath me damp, and a single, terrifying thought frozen in my mind. The house was alive, and it was watching me. The morning after the first night, sunlight poured through the broken blinds, but it did little to calm my nerves. The house seemed quieter than before, yet the silence felt heavy, almost suffocating, like the calm before a storm. I tried to convince myself that the shadows, the whispers, the strange reflection in the mirror, were all products of my imagination. But as I moved through the rooms, I noticed subtle changes. The furniture slightly shifted. Scratches I hadn't seen before etched into the walls like jagged veins, and dust patterns that suggested someone or something had walked through while I slept. I decided to explore more thoroughly, starting with the basement. The narrow wooden stairs creaked under my weight, each step echoing ominously in the confined space. The air grew damp and cold, carrying the scent of rot and something metallic I couldn't place. In a corner, hidden beneath years of grime and cobwebs, was an old chest. Its latch was rusted shut, but with a sharp twist it gave way. Inside were hundreds of photographs, black and white images of people I didn't recognize. They all posed in front of the house, smiling at the camera, yet each had their eyes scratched out, deep, deliberate gouges that made my stomach churn. The dates on the photos spanned decades, some going back nearly a century, yet they all shared a strange consistency. The sand beneath their feet looked impossibly fresh, as if the photos had been taken yesterday. I flipped through them feverishly, a cold sweat running down my back. Then I found one that made my heart stop. It was of the house as I had seen it yesterday, and in the corner of the photo, a faint shadow lurked, partially hidden, watching. I dropped the photograph and it fluttered to the floor as if rejecting me. I needed fresh air. Stepping outside onto the cliffs, the wind hit me with a force that made my head spin. The beach stretched out below, empty and silent, yet there was a strange order to the sand. Small piles of shells formed patterns I could not comprehend, shapes that looked almost ritualistic. Then I saw them, footprints leading toward the water. They were human in shape, but far too large for any person. What chilled me the most was that the footprints disappeared at the edge of the surf. The sand near the waves was undisturbed, calm. No one had emerged. It was as if the ocean had claimed them before they could return. Back in the house, I felt it again, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. The shadows seemed denser now, stretching across the walls in impossible angles. Doors I had left closed now hung slightly ajar. My footsteps echoed too loudly, yet I could hear another set of steps following me, heavier, deliberate. I convinced myself it was paranoia until I saw the footprints in the dust on the stairs. Mine, yes, but another set followed closely behind, deeper and darker, sinking into the floor as though weightless yet impossibly heavy. The day passed slowly, each moment a test of my nerves. When night came, the wind and waves grew louder, the house rattling with every gust. The whispers returned, this time more distinct, though still fragmented. Leave, stay, do not look. They came from every corner, bouncing off walls and floorboards in a chaotic echo that made it impossible to focus. My eyes kept darting to the mirrors. Each time I passed one, the reflection shifted slightly. Once, it grinned at me with teeth I did not have. Sleep offered no relief. Every dream was a nightmare. I was back on the cliffs, looking down at the waves. Figures floated just beneath the water, faceless and silent, reaching up with hands that disappeared as they broke the surface. I woke, gasping, heart pounding, only to find the bedroom floor damp with cold sand. Footprints scattered across it, small, childlike, but unmistakably human. None of them were mine. I tried to convince myself that leaving would be simple, but the car refused to start. Tires spun uselessly in the sand outside, and the house seemed to hum with quiet amusement. It was as if it had trapped me, measured my fear, and decided I was not yet finished. Each night, the presence grew stronger, more confident, testing the edges of my sanity. I began to dread daylight, knowing that even in the sun, the house's hold over me would not weaken. As I lay awake that night, listening to the waves pound against the cliffs and the wind howl through the broken windows, I felt it brush against my arm, soft and wet like a hand, but when I reached for it, there was nothing there. The whispers rose to a fevered pitch, and for the first time I understood the truth. The house had not simply been waiting for me, it had been expecting me, preparing me, drawing me in, like a tide pulling at the shore, and it wasn't finished yet. By the third day, I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. The house was no longer just a building, it felt alive, as if it breathed around me, shifted when I wasn't looking, and listened to my every thought. Sleep had become impossible. Each night, the whispers grew louder, more urgent, more coherent. They were no longer just sounds, they carried intent, meaning. Sometimes they repeated my name, sometimes they commanded me to stay, sometimes to leave, though it had become painfully obvious that leaving was no longer an option. I started keeping a journal, desperately hoping that writing things down would help me rationalize what was happening, but the house did not like to be observed. Words I wrote in the morning would change by evening. Sentences twisted into warnings I had never written. Messages that chilled me to the bone. You belong to us. The tide will claim you. The ocean remembers everything. My hands shook each time I read them, and I tore pages out, only to find the notes reappearing, scattered across the floor the next morning. I needed to understand the house, so I ventured into the attic, a place I had avoided before. The stairs were steep and narrow, coated in a layer of dust that muffled my steps but revealed the faint outlines of others who had walked there before me. The air smelled of rot, seaweed, and something acrid that burned my nose. The attic itself was small and suffocating, but as I dug through debris, I found a hidden door leading to a crawlspace. It was narrow, just large enough to squeeze into when the walls were covered in names, hundreds, maybe thousands, scratched into the wood in jagged, hurried letters. Some were centuries old, others fresh, as if someone had been here recently. I ran my fingers over the letters and froze. My own name was etched there, pulsing faintly under my touch. I felt a shock run through my body, a cold wave that left me trembling. My heart raced, pounding in my ears, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The house had been waiting for me specifically, marking me as part of its history. I stumbled backward, almost falling, and heard a sound that made my blood run cold, the faint scraping of nails along the wooden walls, moving closer, circling me, though I saw no one. That night, the ocean outside seemed angry, unnatural. The waves pounded against the cliffs with a rhythm that mirrored the racing of my heart, shaking the floorboards, rattling the windows, making the house groan as though it were alive and in pain. Shadows shifted unnaturally across the walls, reaching, stretching, clawing at me. The mirrors, which had remained cracked since the first night, warped further, reflecting shapes I could not comprehend. Once, I swore I saw someone pressed against the glass from the other side, pale and motionless, staring directly at me. The photographs in the basement had changed, too. Faces twisted into expressions of torment, mouths open in silent screams. I saw figures in them I did not recognize, yet something about them was intimately familiar. And then I realized my own reflection appeared in some of the older photographs, always in the corner, always looking terrified, always alone. One was dated yesterday, yet it showed me standing in a spot I had not visited yet. I stumbled back, my stomach churning, realizing that the house and maybe whatever haunted it had control over time itself, or at least my perception of it. When I went outside to the cliffs to clear my head, I found a message written in the sand. Large letters, carved perfectly. Despite the wind and surf, you cannot leave. I spun around, certain someone was behind me, but the beach was empty, the only sound the relentless crash of waves. The footprints I had seen before were gone, yet a cold sense of being watched pressed down on me, heavier than before. I felt eyes in the wind, in the sand, in the shadows of the house, tracking my every movement. By the end of the day, exhaustion and fear consumed me. The house had become an extension of my mind, feeding off my anxiety, twisting my thoughts. I could no longer tell what was real. Even my own reflection, which should have reassured me, had become a stranger. The whispers now followed me everywhere, infiltrating my dreams. They promised pain, claimed ownership, and hinted at the ocean's role in taking anyone who tried to escape. And when I tried to sleep that night, I felt it again, wet and cold, brushing my arm as I lay in bed. My eyes shot open, but the room was empty. Yet the unmistakable smell of salt and decay lingered, heavy in the air. My heart pounded as I realized the truth. The house was alive, and it had chosen me. I was no longer merely a visitor. I was part of its story, and whatever had been waiting in the shadows, beneath the floorboards and within the walls, was patient. It had all the time in the world. By the fourth day, I no longer felt safe anywhere in the house. Every room, every hallway, every shadow seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The whispers had grown insistent, circling me, crawling under my skin, echoing in my head even when the wind outside was calm. I could no longer tell if the sounds were real or a projection of my fear, but the terror they invoked was tangible. The house had stopped pretending to be empty. It was now an active predator, testing me, observing me, and I felt smaller with every passing hour. The tide outside behaved strangely. It rose and fell, not in accordance with the moon, but almost deliberately, creeping closer to the cliffs each night, the waves lapping as if trying to reach the house itself. Sometimes I could hear faint voices carried by the surf, soft and urgent, like a distant crowd calling my name. But the words were warped, fragmented, impossible to fully understand. When I approached the windows, hoping for clarity, all I saw was endless, restless water, black and churning, as though the ocean had taken on its own consciousness. Inside, the walls were changing. Damp streaks appeared overnight, running like rivulets of salt water, forming shapes that resembled faces twisted in agony. Every time I passed, it felt as though the eyes of those faces followed me. The shadows grew longer, stretching across the floors and ceiling, and I began noticing shapes where there should have been none, figures lurking in corners, just beyond the edges of vision, vanishing when I looked directly. The mirrors were worse. They no longer reflected reality. They reflected versions of me that were wrong-twisted, smiling, frozen in fear. Once, I glimpsed my own reflection smiling while I stood rigid with terror, and I could swear the reflection moved independently, stepping closer to the glass. That evening I saw the figure again on the deck, silhouetted against the moonlight. It was tall, impossibly thin, and its hollow eyes seemed to penetrate me, reading my every thought. I froze, unable to move, and for a moment I thought it might vanish like before, but this time it didn't. Its feet left wet impressions on the deck, heavy and deep, though I could see no legs beneath it. Slowly it stepped toward the sliding door, then paused and disappeared into the house, leaving a trail of water behind it. My stomach twisted in fear. Whatever it was no longer outside, it was inside now. I tried to barricade myself in the attic, hoping the narrow space and locked door would keep me safe. But safety was an illusion. The ceiling above me creaked as if a massive weight were pacing, and the walls vibrated with a low hum. Then came the scratching, slow at first, then frantic, as if something desperate were clawing to get in. The shadows on the walls lengthened unnaturally, spreading across the floor and ceiling like liquid darkness. I could feel them pressing closer, and every instinct screamed at me to run. But I was trapped in a web I could not see, the house itself twisting the space around me. In the corner of the attic, a hand emerged from the wall, skeletal, wet, and dripping with cold seawater. I stumbled back, barely catching myself, my heart racing. The whispers had grown to a crescendo, a chorus of urgent voices speaking all at once, repeating my name, taunting me, commanding me. I realized then that the house fed on fear and memory, consuming both in a slow, deliberate hunger. The walls themselves were not solid. They were a membrane between reality and something else, something that had existed for centuries, waiting for someone like me to arrive. By the early hours, I could no longer distinguish between what was real and what was imagined. The waves outside roared, the wind screamed, and the house groaned as if alive. Figures from the mirrors and shadows pressed closer, circling me, watching me. My body ached with exhaustion, and my mind was fraying. I understood finally that I had been drawn here intentionally. The house had selected me, prepared me, and now it would not let me leave. Every exit led back inside, every attempt to escape thwarted by some unseen force. I could feel it then, crawling over my skin, pressing in on my chest, whispering in tones that were almost loving, almost protective, but beneath it was hunger. The house wanted something from me, and I was powerless to resist. I could hear the ocean pounding against the cliffs below, merging with the creaking floors and screaming walls, and I realized the tide itself was part of this entity, part of the house's mechanism for trapping and consuming. And for the first time, I understood the true terror. The house, the shadows, the ocean, they had been waiting for me my whole life, and there was no one else to save me. The final night came with a darkness that felt heavier than anything I had experienced before. The house was no longer merely a building. It had become an extension of my mind, a predator shaped by my fear. Every creak, every gust of wind, every crash of the waves against the cliffs echoed in my chest. Synchronized with my racing heartbeat, I no longer distinguished between the house and myself. The shadows, the walls, the mirrors all were extensions of something vast, something ancient, and it had been waiting for this moment. I tried to flee. I ran from room to room, searching for a door, a window, a way out, but each exit led me back inside. The house shifted around me as if mocking my efforts, its hallways stretching impossibly, rooms rearranging themselves when I turned away. The mirrors reflected not only my own terrified face, but countless versions of me, each one trapped in endless fear, screaming silently, eyes wide and unblinking. I could see them in the corners of every mirror, moving independently, reaching toward me with distorted, pale hands. I reached the deck, desperate for some connection to the outside world, some way to escape the relentless terror. The ocean below churned violently, waves crashing against the cliffs as though the water itself were alive, and I could see shapes beneath the surface, enormous, indistinct, moving with purpose. Figures floated just beneath the waves, pale and faceless, reaching up with long, ghostly arms, pressing against some invisible barrier that separated them from the house. I realized with a sickening certainty that they were former visitors, former victims, now trapped between the world of the living and the house's domain. I stumbled backward, fear rooting me in place, and turned to the house only to see that it had changed completely. The walls were now mirrors, reflecting endless versions of me, all screaming silently, all trapped, all watched. Shadows moved along these mirrored surfaces, slithering like smoke, coalescing into shapes that seemed almost human but with hollow, endless eyes. The figure I had seen on the deck before emerged again, stepping out from one of the shadows. Its presence was overwhelming, a cold wave that drained all warmth from my body. It had no face, yet I could feel it studying me, reading every thought, every fear, every memory I had ever owned. I understood then that the house was not simply haunted, it was a living organism, a predator sustained by fear and despair. The ocean, the cliffs, the house itself, they were all parts of a single entity, a force that had existed long before I was born and would continue long after I was gone, and I had been drawn here not by accident but by design. My arrival had been anticipated, orchestrated, and now there was no escape. I tried to scream, but my voice was swallowed by the walls. The mirrors reflected not my panic but my inevitability. The shadows pressed closer, solidifying into forms that resembled the figures from the photographs in the crawl space, all staring with hollow, accusing eyes. I realized with a cold, hopeless clarity that the house had marked me, chosen me as its next story, and that the tide, the ocean, and the cliffs were all participants in this ancient ritual. Then, a whisper rose above all the others, calm and deliberate, carrying over the crash of the waves. "You were never leaving." The words echoed in my skull, not just as sound but as a physical weight, pressing against my chest, filling my lungs. I turned toward the mirrors one last time and saw it not my reflection, but myself, or rather, what I had become. Pale, twisted, frozen in fear, eyes wide and hollow. Trapped eternally behind glass that was not glass at all but a membrane, a prison between worlds. The last thing I remember before the darkness consumed me completely was the sensation of falling, though I was not moving. The ocean roared beneath me, the wind screamed through the cliffs, and the house groaned as if in delight. I could hear the faintest echoes of others screaming, calling my name, warning me, faces pressed against the mirrors, shadows writhing in endless torment, and then silence. Now, sometimes, when the tide is high and the moon is full, people say you can hear screams coming from the cliffs, carried faintly on the wind. They say the beach house is empty, yet if you look closely through the windows, you might see a figure staring back, trapped behind the glass, smiling a twisted, unrecognizable smile. And sometimes, when the waves crash just right, I can feel it again, the pull of the house, the whispers promising that the story is never over, that it is still waiting for its next visitor. The house stands there to this day, perched on the cliffs, overlooking the restless ocean. Its windows are dark, its walls silent, but the footprints in the sand appear every morning, leading to the deck, then disappearing into nothing. And though no one can see it, I know the truth. It never lets go. I am part of it now, as much a shadow as the others, waiting for the next person to arrive, to write their story, to become a whisper carried on the wind.